So, how do you build a country from scratch? Seriously, think about it. You just won a revolution against a king. How do you make sure your new government doesn't become the exact same thing you just fought against? Well, that's the story we're diving into today. The story of the U.S. Constitution, forged in a hot Philadelphia summer through some absolutely brilliant debate and some really painful compromise. All right, picture this. It's 1783. The American Revolution, it's over. The colonists have won. They're independent. But that victory comes with this huge looming question. Independent, now what? I mean, they had to create a whole new government. The Declaration of Independence even says it's the people's right to do that. But here's the kicker. There was no blueprint, no instruction manual. They were making it up as they went. So their first crack at it was something called the Articles of Confederation. And to put it mildly, it did not go well. The whole thing was like a ship sailing straight into a hurricane, but with no captain and no rudder. It was, in a word, a disaster. Okay, so why was it such a spectacular failure? To get that, we've got to look at the crisis that was brewing under these Articles of Confederation. The main issue, really, was fear. They were terrified of creating another tyrant, another king. So in trying to avoid that, they swung way too far in the other direction and made the central government incredibly weak. I mean, think about this. The government couldn't tax anyone, so it had zero money. It couldn't raise an army, so it couldn't defend the country. There was no president, no national court system. You basically had 13 little countries all doing their own thing. The whole nation was literally falling apart at the seams. All right, so it was obvious this wasn't working. They needed a do-over, a mulligan. So, in 1787, delegates met up in Philadelphia for what we now call the Constitutional Convention. Now, their first thought was just to patch up the articles, fix the mess. But it didn't take them long to realize they had to scrap the whole thing and start from scratch to build a government that was just right. And this is where the whole Goldilocks idea comes in. You know the story, right? The Articles of Confederation. That government was too weak. The British monarchy they just escaped, way too strong. What they needed was something in the middle. Something strong enough to actually run the country and solve real problems, but also weak enough that it couldn't just trample all over people's rights. It had to be, you guessed it, just right. But of course, finding that perfect balance is way easier said than done. That summer in Philly was intense. We're talking furious, knockdown, drag-out debates. If they were going to pull this off, if they were going to create a new nation, they were all going to have to learn the art of compromise. And the first huge fight that almost blew the whole thing up came down to a simple-sounding question. In the new Congress, how do we decide how many representatives each state gets? Seems straightforward, right? Wrong. This question pitted the big states against the small states in this massive, bitter fight for power. So on one side, you had the Virginia Plan. This was the big states' idea. States like Virginia, obviously. They said representation should be based on population. Makes sense, right? More people, more votes, more power. But then you had the New Jersey Plan, which was the small states' comeback. They argued for equal representation, one state, one vote, period. And for weeks, nobody would budge. They were completely deadlocked. The solution that finally broke the stalemate was a total breakthrough. We call it the Great Compromise. And what was it? Basically, they decided to do both. They created what's called a bicameral legislature. That just means it has two houses or two chambers. In one, the House of Representatives, representation is based on population. That made the big states happy. And in the other, the Senate, every single state gets two votes. That made the small states happy. It's the exact same system we have today. Okay, so they solved one massive problem. But in doing so, they uncovered an even bigger, much more painful one, an issue that would haunt the United States for the next 80 years and beyond: slavery. And this table really gets to the heart of the conflict. The southern states, they wanted to count their entire enslaved population. Why? To get more representatives in Congress, which meant more political power. The northern states were, frankly, horrified. They argued you can't treat people as property one minute and then count them as full persons for political power the next. And look at those numbers. With nearly 40% of Virginia's population enslaved, this was not a minor disagreement. It was about the fundamental balance of power in this new country. So what did they do? They reached another compromise. And this one was just terrible. It's known as the 3/5 compromise. To keep the southern states from walking out, they agreed that for the purpose of counting population for representation, every 5 enslaved people would be counted as 3 people. It was a dark, cynical bargain that basically bakes slavery right into the foundation of the new government. All right, with those huge, painful compromises out of the way, the founders could finally focus on the actual architecture of the government. And they were obsessed with one single goal: building a machine, a system that would make tyranny impossible. Their first really clever idea was something called federalism. Instead of piling all the power into one central spot, they split it. They divided power between the new national or federal government and the state governments. This was a pretty revolutionary idea at the time, that power could be shared instead of just held by one supreme authority. And this diagram shows you pretty clearly how it works. You've got the federal government doing things like coining money, then you've got the state governments handling things like setting the driving age, and then some powers, like collecting taxes, are shared by both. This division of power, right off the bat, was their first line of defense against tyranny. Okay, so the second big safeguard was the separation of powers. They took the power of that national government and they split it again, this time into three distinct branches: the legislative, which makes the laws, the executive, which enforces them, and the judicial, which interprets them. The whole point was to avoid what they'd seen with kings and monarchs, where one person or group could make the laws, enforce the laws, and judge the laws. Here, no single branch could control the whole show. But then you have to ask, right? What happens if one of those branches starts getting too powerful, starts overstepping its bounds? Well, that brings us to the third and, honestly, maybe the most brilliant part of their anti-tyranny machine. A good way to think about it is like a giant game of rock, paper, scissors. And that game of rock, paper, scissors is what we call checks and balances. Each branch was given specific powers to block or check the other two. For example, Congress can pass a law, but the president can veto it, right? But then Congress can override that veto. The president appoints a judge, but the Senate has to approve them. And then the Supreme Court can turn around and declare a law passed by Congress and signed by the president to be unconstitutional. It's this constant, deliberate power struggle, all designed to keep any one part of the government from getting too big for its britches. So the Constitution is written. Great. But the fight wasn't over, not by a long shot. Before it could actually become law, it had to be ratified, or formally approved, by at least 9 of the 13 states. And this was a massive hurdle because a lot of Americans were still really, really afraid of a powerful central government. And this set off a fierce, nationwide debate. You basically had two teams. On one side, the Federalists. They were all in on the new Constitution. They argued that this was the strong, effective government the country desperately needed to survive. On the other side, you had the Anti-Federalists. They looked at the same document and saw something scary: a government that was too big, too powerful, and that would eventually crush the very rights they just fought a war for. The Anti-Federalists' #1 complaint, their biggest sticking point, was this: the Constitution didn't explicitly protect individual rights. Their demand was pretty simple, but it was powerful. They said, give us a Bill of Rights. Give us a list written down of all the rights the government absolutely cannot take away. So how do you think they solved this final, huge debate? Yep, you guessed it, compromise. This last compromise was all about a promise. It was the promise to add that Bill of Rights. And it was the final piece of the puzzle they needed to actually bring this whole Constitution to life. So, the deal was struck. The Federalists agreed. Okay, you win. We promise we will add a Bill of Rights. It'll be the very first thing the new government does. And with that promise on the table, the states finally ratified the Constitution in 1788. And true to their word, by 1791, the first 10 amendments, what we know as the Bill of Rights, were officially added, protecting all those essential freedoms like speech, religion, and the press. So in the end, the founders designed this incredible, really durable machine to try and balance liberty and order. It's a machine that runs on splitting up power, on checks and balances, and most of all, on compromise. And that leaves us with a pretty big question, one that's just as important today as it was back in 1787. How do we, the people, keep this more than 200-year-old machine in balance?